Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, I am your host Simon. Welcome to the episode Lost in Space, the chilling echoes of the Phantom Cosmonauts. Written by Danny. Thank you so much, Danny. Read by me. Never read it before, although I am vaguely familiar with this story because this, if I'm not mistaken, is about some... spoiler alert. I think it's some Italian dudes who hear like some mysterious sounds from space and they think it's like Russian cosmonauts dying or something, and I don't think it is, because that would be a bigger part of the historical record that I think I'd be aware of, but I remember there being some sort of weirdness to it, which is what we do here at Decoding the Unknown, isn't it? So sit back, relax.
Oh, yeah.
And stay vigilant if you're driving, perhaps. I know a lot of people, I get people saying, like, I get a surprising number of messages from truck drivers, shout out truck drivers, who are like, yeah, no, I listen to you while driving coast to coast, like, butter and toast. I don't know.
Yeah, you know what? I'm a little behind on my trucker terms.
If you ever happen to take a holiday on the moon, I'd heartily recommend paying a quick visit to the local graveyard found in the valley known as Hadley Rill. Well, I say graveyard, but it might be pushing it a bit. But you should still stumble across the Fallen Astronaut Memorial, which was planted there by the crew of the Apollo 15 mission back in 1971. An aluminium sculpture of an astronaut sits next to a commemorative plaque, which lists the names of all the astronauts and cosmonauts who had tragically lost their lives by that point in the pursuit of space exploration. Well, it was the idea anyway. The fact is, there are certain names missing from this lunar roll of honor. And whilst this cluster of absent trailblazers included at least a couple of Americans, the majority of them hailed from the Soviet Union. These are the Phantom Cosmonauts who were claimed by the Void whilst charting the final frontier, but were subsequently hidden from the history books and airbrushed out of official photographs, dashing any hope of getting a name check on the Moon Memorial, although we often never know their names anyway. During the 1960s, a pair of celebrated amateur radio enthusiasts known as the Jadika Cordiglia brothers may have stumbled upon a whole series of haunting final messages from some of these lost cosmonauts mere moments before they perished in flame on a doomed attempt to return home. However, like at the time, like now a lot of time has passed and there's been there's the perestroika and glasnost or whatever, like the Soviet Union opens up a bunch of like classified that they were up to. Do I really believe they released it all? No. But do I believe like this sort of stuff would come out between the 60s and now? Yes. But at the time, I'll be like, no, I entirely believe it. Yeah, why would they say? They're just, probably the Americans do it as well. One particularly eerie final message is from a distressed woman who may forever be described as the unknown female cosmonaut. She delivers a lengthy panicked cry for a response and further guidance before the message cuts out and she falls into deathly silence. And this is just the tip of the rocket's nose cone, yes! Whilst it's believed that Yuri Gagarin was supposedly the first man in space, earlier evidence suggests that previous cosmonauts had beaten him to it, but they didn't survive to tell the tale. Their historic achievements were destined to disintegrate among the stars. I can reveal, right now, that the often forgotten Ivan Ivanovich made it into space a whole year before Yuri Gagarin, but he certainly didn't get a hero's welcome or a line on the memorial plaque. Is this part of the conspiracy? There's a pulsating web of genuine Soviet secrets and cover-ups at work here, which sent these lost cosmonauts spiraling into oblivion, and to hide the crushing failures and terrible tragedies of the desperate race to the infinite beyond. Diamond Dogs. It wouldn't be too much out of this world to suggest that the Soviet Union were running Saturn rings around the US for the majority of the space race that heated up between 1955 and 1972. Yeah, because they got the first satellite in space, the first man in space, the first man on the moon. Oh wait, no, that's that TV show. For All Mankind, which is fantastic. I'm looking forward to that coming back. Capitalism may have been the front runner when it came to theme parks, innovation through competition, consumer choice, economic growth, and not having to queue for hours for crap food. But communism clearly had the winning ticket, at least for a while, when it came to asserting dominance in the stars, as the USSR appeared to be first past the post with all the major historical milestones. First nation to launch an artificial satellite into orbit? That would be the Soviet Union, when they launched Sputnik 1 into an elliptical low Earth orbit on the 4th of October 1957. The first nation to launch a living creature into orbit. That would be the Soviet Union when they put Laika the dog into Sputnik 2 just a month later. Now, of course, Laika didn't have any say in the matter. The stray mongrel was picked up from the streets of Moscow and probably wasn't aware that she only had a one-way ticket aboard Sputnik 2. Wasn't there that thing, like, that they thought she died quite quickly afterwards, but it later came out that no, she'd lived for a while and was just kind of circling around, just gradually running out of air. God, that's so grim. Jesus, communism. Jesus, Soviet Russia, why? I feel I was a bit misled about this. Everything I know about the stars comes from a tatty old children's book called Doctor Who Discovers Space Travel, first published in 1976. The ever-grinning scarf lord Tom Baker takes the TARDIS out on an educational journey through the history of the space age in a fascinating book which has lots of cool pictures and came with a free pull-out poster. Pretty sure, have I mentioned this before? My nan was friends with Tom Baker. He lived in the same little village that she lived in. I think it was Tom Baker. It was one of the guys who played Doctor Who. I think he had crazy hair. Has? He's probably dead, right? Because my nan's she's dead now, but she was really old. She was like well in her 90s. And that was years ago. Siri, is Tom Baker still alive? He's probably dead for ages, isn't he? Oh, he's 91. He is alive. He is old, though. Sorry, Tom. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the book quickly glosses over the fate of Laika the space dog and simply mentions that she was kept alive in Sputnik 2 for a long time. It's like, and there she lived for a long time. And if by long time we mean 3 days. It wasn't that long, though. It was never intended for Laika to survive the journey, and she died from overheating within 5 to 7 hours of the launch. Okay, there we go. But that still technically makes her the world's first traveller to orbit the Earth. She didn't get a name on that memorial plaque on the moon, though. Wankers. I still like to cling to the hope that she was rescued by aliens at the last minute. The first nation to put a human being into space? That would be the Soviet Union when Yuri Gagarin, apparently, orbited the Earth for the first time aboard Vostok 1 on April the 12th, 1961. Yuri was one of the many cosmonauts to emerge from an area near Moscow, which was officially known as Closed Military Townlet No. 1, but is more commonly known as Star City. Not only was it the location of a top-secret military training center for cosmonauts, Star City was also a thriving closed city in its own right and home to the families of the cosmonauts who could take advantage of the stores, schools, post offices, and movie theaters. You probably struggle to find a McDonald's, though. You'd still struggle to find a McDonald's in Russia today. You'd find their alternative that took over when McDonald's decided to leave because they invaded a sovereign nation. As Yuri orbited the Earth for an hour and 48 minutes, one of his fellow cosmonaut buddies would have been anxiously watching developments and awaiting his safe return. His name was Komarov, and he would be dead before the end of the decade in an apparent bid to save Yuri's life, but more on that much later. Right, there was a rocket that was so dodgy, and I think Komarov was scheduled, and Yuri was like, I will go. And he's like, no, I will go. And they knew it was just going to blow up because it was just completely a piece of and it did. And Komarov died. Is Komarov in For All Mankind? I think he is, right? When Yuri did indeed make it back down to Earth in one piece, he was naturally treated like a national treasure for the rest of his life, and was probably one of the most famous people on the planet at the time, right up there with Marilyn Monroe, the Beatles, Martin Luther King Jr., and Yogi Bear. One interesting point here is that there was global suspicion right from the very beginning, and not many people outside the Soviet Union would have initially believed that a man had been sent into space. On the surface, it sounded like they were just winding us up and trying to look all clever and superior. It wasn't accepted as fact until much later that day when President Kennedy confirmed that a man had been placed into orbit around the Earth and extended his congratulations to the Soviet Union through presumably gritted teeth. Indeed. Things really weren't looking too good for the US space program as the Soviets continued to smash all of the big milestones. The first nation to conduct a long-duration spaceflight, that'd be the Soviet Union when German Titov completed 17 orbits in just over 25 hours aboard Vostok 2 on August the 6th, 1961. The first nation to put a woman into space, that would be the Soviet Union with Valentina Tereshkova completing 48 orbits over 3 days aboard Vostok 6 from June the 16th, 1963. The first nation to conduct a spacewalk, that'd be the Soviet Union with Alexei Leonov spending 12 minutes performing a funky spacewalk whilst tethered to Voskhod 2 in 1965. The first nation to achieve a soft moon landing, that would be the Soviet Union when the unmanned spacecraft Luna 9 touched down on the moon in 1966 and transmitted pictures from the lunar surface. The list goes on and into infinity. And beyond?
You are a sad, strange little man.
Well, I say that. Actually, the list came to a pretty abrupt halt in 1969 when American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon and resisted the urge to flip the bird to the Soviet Union as he took his first small step. The USSR may have won some major battles in the space race, but the US ultimately won the War of the Worlds. After this, the Soviets decided that they didn't want to play this silly game anymore and prioritized more pressing matters closer to home. By 1975, they were collaborating with the US on the Apollo-Soyuz test project, heralding a new era of cooperation rather than competition as the Cold War finally began to thaw a little. Nice times. But let's rewind back to Yuri Gagarin and the claim that he was the first man in space. Some have suggested that it might be more accurate to say that he was the first man to survive a trip into space, as he was only following in the footsteps of his secret predecessors who never made the return leg of the journey. Another theory is that Yuri never even made it into space at all, but stole all the glory from the guy who did. The first point is something to chew over, because you'd think that the Soviets might still claim a victory, even if the cosmonaut ended up as stardust. Yeah, maybe. I don't know, it's hard to say. Big difference between a person and a dog. Although the internet would apparently disagree. I mean, they were happy enough to revel in the success of sending the first living creature into space and proudly accept that activity badge, even though they had no intention of bringing back Laika the space dog. No, but I think, like, animal testing, right? Sorry, let's not name a company because litigation. It's always certainly, it's always companies animal test. I'm fine with it. We have to test stuff. Otherwise, someone's going to take a pill and die. And the reality of it is we as a species value our species more than other species. It's just how it is. I'm so sorry. But companies are like, yeah, no, we tried it on animals. Some animals died. But they're not going to be like, oh yeah, we tried it on people and people died. That is a much bigger problem. I suppose it's slightly different when we're talking about human beings than dogs, or at least I'm led to believe that's what other people might think. If a mission ends with the death of a human, then it could be considered a depressing failure, and the Soviets might prefer to wait for a story that had a proper happy ending. But even so, it's believed by many that the Soviets were in such a frantic rush to stay ahead of the US that they treated the early secret cosmonauts in pretty much the same way as Laika. Whilst they were confidently propelling cosmonauts into space, they still haven't fully figured out how to get them back again. It's like, up you go, Vlad. It's like, guys, how do I get back down? And they're like, figure it out, mate. That's why we sent you up there, Vlad. Come on. However, there is one man in particular whose name keeps cropping up as a potential candidate for the real first man in space. But the slightly odd thing about Vladimir Ilyushin's story is that he did apparently survive the journey a whole 5 days before Yuri's trip. In fact, he lived to be 82 and died in 2010. It wasn't just the mission, it's just that the mission ended on a slightly embarrassing note, which the Soviet Union wasn't prepared to make public. The British communist newspaper The Daily Worker was the first to break the story that day that Yuri Gagarin's historic flight was officially confirmed. They're like, yes, communism, yes! The journalist Dennis Ogden reported that he had been tipped off by reliable sources that the first true flight had taken place 5 days earlier when Vladimir Ilyushin was in the pilot seat. And it's quite feasible that Dennis had reliable sources, as the Daily Worker had connections with the Kremlin. 5 days earlier, the Soviet Union had announced that the military officer and test pilot Vladimir Ilyushin had been seriously injured in a car crash and was now receiving specialist treatment in China. Oh, that is extremely suspicious. I guess the theory is going to be that he got seriously injured in a spacecraft crash landing, and it crash landed in China, where he's being treated because that's where he crash landed. But the Daily Worker reported that this was a cover story to hide the fact that Ilyushin had actually flown into space, but was seriously injured during re-entry back to Earth, and that kind of put a downer on everything. It was a theory that was picked up and expanded on by several other newspapers around the world, and was still going strong by 1999 when a documentary film called The Cosmonaut Cover-Up was first screened on UK Horizons. The documentary depicts the whole hushed story of Ilyushin and arrives at the firm conclusion that he was most definitely the first man in space. We learn that Vladimir Ilyushin was a highly experienced and decorated test pilot with an influential father who was a pretty famous aircraft designer. After becoming involved in the Soviet space program, it would seem that Ilyushin's credentials and experience would mark him out as the obvious candidate to take the maiden voyage into space, and some may have found it puzzling that he was overlooked in favor of Yuri Gagarin. If I remember though, Yuri Gagarin was like a peasant, right? He came from like a peasant family, which obviously, the communists love. And I think the other guy who they were considering wasn't. He was from like a bourgeois family or something like that. Or at least slightly higher up in the previous social structure. But the theory goes that he wasn't overlooked at all. Ilyushin flew into space in a capsule named Rossiya on April 7th, 1961, and orbited the Earth 3 times. However, he then lost contact with ground control and was forced to make an emergency unguided landing back to Earth. Oh my god, an emergency landing from space. That. Considering the circumstances, he made quite a good fist of it by landing in a relatively safe spot in China. He could just as easily have landed on top of the Natureland Seal Sanctuary in Skegness, which might have led to a bit more explaining. But it was a bit of a bumpy landing in China, and Ilyushin was critically injured, which means that the Soviets weren't too keen to share the historic news with the world, so they instead declared that Ilyushin had been injured in a nasty car crash and sent to China for the best possible treatment. 1960s China for the best possible treatment? Pretty sure the Soviet Union was quite some way ahead of 1960s China, right? A further prickly problem is that the USSR and China were not getting on at this point, and the documentary suggests that Ilyushin may have been held captive in China for well over a year, another unfortunate development which the Soviets were keen to suppress whilst they negotiated his freedom. The theory gets a little wilder when we soar majestically into the suggestion that Vladimir Ilyushin's flight into space was the only one to take place in April 1961, and that Yuri Gagarin never actually made it to the stars at all. An article published in US News and World Report in 1961 concluded that Yuri was instead dragged away from Star City to take part in a staged landing in Ilyushin's backup capsule so that he could become the smiling poster boy for the Soviets' glorious triumph. Ilyushin himself wouldn't have been the ideal candidate to engage with the global press if he was still fighting for his life in a Chinese hospital bed under armed guard. The Soviets denied all of this, and in fact they denied that Ilyushin was even a cosmonaut. But the official story of what really happened to Ilyushin was frequently inconsistent and contradictory. And one point that really doesn't seem to add up is why they would have sent Ilyushin to China after he was supposedly injured in a car crash, right? You'd think that they would have taken care of their own highly decorated test pilot instead of packing him off to a country with which they were enduring troubled relations. This is very suspicious, isn't it? So could there be any truth in the widely reported idea that Vladimir Ilyushin was the first man in space? Well, we'll leave him hanging in zero gravity for a while as we move on to those Italian amateur radio operators known as the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. They were amassing their own quite staggering archive of evidence which indicated that a whole gang of unknown cosmonauts may have quietly fallen through a black hole of cruel deception. Dun dun dun! Moonage Daydream. Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia were born in northern Italy in the 1930s, and they were raised in the town of Urba near Lake Como. They developed an obsessive passion for radio technology when they were very young. Whilst other kids their age were playing conkers, making dens, throwing conkers at girls, and rolling around in dog muck, Achille and Giovanni were attempting to build their own radio antennas and dreamed of setting up their own shortwave station. Nerds! Why aren't you throwing conkers at girls, Giovanni? I'm busy making my radio. It was difficult, though, as the Giudica Cordiglia family were not exactly minted. As the boys grew older, their physician father grumpily told them that they should stop pissing about with radios and concentrate a bit more on their studies. But their mother was a lot more supportive. She discovered that the US military was shifting surplus radio equipment at bargain bucket prices and would regularly come home with new bits and pieces for the boys. By the 1950s, when Achille and Giovanni were both in their 20s, they'd knocked up a massive antenna, which they plonked on the roof of their modest family apartment. And this was to prove particularly handy on the 4th of October 1957, when the brothers found themselves tuning in to a truly historic moment. Out of the blue, the Soviets had just announced the successful launch of the world's first artificial satellite to be hurtled into space and generously shared the radio frequency on which it could be heard. Generously. Propaganda piece. The brothers wondered if they might be able to intercept the signal of Sputnik 1 themselves, and it turned out that they absolutely could. The result might not have seemed terribly interesting to everyone. They effectively just heard a series of short pulsed tones, which could be scientifically described as a bucket of beep beeps. But this was a game-changer moment for Achille and Giovanni, who were both fizzing over with sheer excitement. They reckoned that they were the first people in Europe to hear the signal for the first satellite to orbit the Earth. A month later, the brothers tuned into the signal of Sputnik 2 carrying Laika the space dog. Again, there would be no chance of picking up anything as interesting as a disgruntled woof, but the accomplishment was quite incredible for a couple of amateurs. 3 months later, the brothers managed to intercept the signal of Explorer 1 as the US finally got around to launching its own satellite. And of course, they were eavesdropping when Yuri Gagarin became the alleged first man in space in 1961. They were probably listening in on the Cosmonauts broadcasts before anyone outside the Soviet Union even knew that Yuri was in space, having been tipped off before the public announcement by a journalist in Moscow that something big was happening in the sky. By this time, Achille and Giovanni had upped their game quite considerably. Following a family move to Turin, Piedmont in northern Italy in 1959, they set up their own experimental listening station in a disused World War II bunker just outside the city, which they christened Torre Bert. That's awesome. I thought they didn't have much money. Now they're just buying a bunker and setting up a radio station. It's awesome. Achille was in medical school at the time, but still spent every spare minute at Torre Bert, whilst Giovanni was pretty much permanently stationed there, as he'd taken a correspondence course in engineering and could be usually found studying whilst wearing his headphones and tuning into the sounds of the celestial realm. I like it. I like that these guys have this big passion. Their initial goal was to listen in on any potential communication between ground control and spacecraft on missions launched by the Soviet Union and the United States, although they later decided to focus their efforts on the USSR, partly because it was closer, but also partly because the Soviet space program was notorious for keeping their cards close to their chest, in contrast to NASA, who were usually far more chatty about upcoming missions. The brothers became intrigued by the idea of stumbling across secretive Soviet launches that nobody was supposed to know about yet. There's no doubting that the brothers did quite a staggering job in setting up Torre Bert on a painfully limited budget. Painfully limited? They bought a bunker. How much is a bunker? Maybe bunkers are cheap. I should buy a bunker. It'd be cool to have a bunker. Nice. Whilst the US and USSR had spent vast fortunes on setting up advanced tracking stations, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers had somehow managed to build a kind of rough-and-ready homemade version of Cape Canaveral on a shoestring. They constructed most of their equipment from scrap metal, old pipes, chicken wire, and discarded military materials. I more wonder if if they were a lot younger, it'd be like, Dad, I made a real car. And it's like, did you? And he shows you two dining room chairs next to each other. You're like, oh, well, sure you did. Sure you did, Remus, sure. I suspect they may have also used some empty washing up bottles and lots of sticky bag plastic. Yet a typical visitor to Torre Bert would have been awestruck by the number of huge antennas, tracking screens, listening consoles, recording equipment, filtering devices, LED displays, and various other bits of kit that flashed lights or made pinging noises when something interesting was happening. And the listening station was attracting plenty of visitors by this point, including reporters, scientists, and fellow enthusiasts who were keen to help out in any way they could with the growing project. Achille and Giovanni had a sister called Maria who had been tasked with the job of learning the Russian language so that they might actually be able to understand any Soviet messages that they happened to intercept. Maria! Come over here, Maria! You gotta learn Russian! It's like, I don't know, why are you making me learn Russian? Giovanni's fiancée Laura was involved in tracking down other space listeners around the world to eventually form a collaborative amateur network connected by shortwave radio that went under the name of Zeus. Between 1959 and 1966, Torre Bert picked up and recorded a whole library of signals and communications, whilst Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia had become minor celebrities. It's clear that there was genius at work here. But some of the recordings were more interesting than others, as they appeared to fly in the face of the official narrative and suggested that terrible secrets were being buried in the inky vastness of space. Lady Stardust. The earliest interceptions predated the alleged historic flight of Yuri Gagarin by a good 5 months. In November 1960, the Bochum Space Observatory in West Germany reported that it identified radio signals which could only have come from a satellite launched from Earth. And that's all fine and dandy, but the puzzling element was that there had been no public announcement of any new satellite launch from either side of the Iron Curtain. The US would almost certainly have made an announcement beforehand if they were about to lob something new into space, and this led Achilles and Giovanni to conclude that the secret satellite may have been Soviet in origin. But would they be able to intercept it themselves? Initially, it seemed as if the answer might be no. As soon as they heard the news, they spent the whole day attempting to locate a signal on the known Soviet frequencies, but were met with only static. Perhaps the Bochum Observatory had just made a mistake. But then, just as they were on the brink of giving up, the static gave way to something entirely unexpected, a rhythmic tapping sound. This was light years away from the random bleeps of the earliest unmanned satellites. This was a purposeful rhythmic pattern that kept repeating over and over again. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. SOS. Now, anyone faintly familiar with Morse code will know that this is the message for stuck in traffic, might be a bit late home tonight, we'll pick you up a takeaway. No, of course, it's the most alarming signal you're ever likely to intercept, the SOS signal. And that's a bit weird if we're meant to be talking about an unmanned satellite, unless perhaps Laika's K9 successors underwent far more training than she was ever allowed and were capable of transmitting distress signals when she began to hit the nitrogen pressurization tank. It does seem a little bit unlikely, though. Giovanni revealed that the object was not orbiting the Earth, but was instead moving slowly into deeper space. Oh, God, can you imagine? You're sending that SOS and it's like, well, what the f*** do you want us to do? We don't have some shit that can come out and rescue you. You're floating off into deep space. You're fucked. Even today, you'd be like, well, what are we going to do? There's nothing we can do this last minute. We wouldn't be able to send something out, catch you, and come back. There's no point even bothering to tap SOS. Just realize how fucked you are. The signal became weaker and weaker until it eventually fell completely silent. The brothers concluded that they'd just intercepted the distress call of a spacecraft in trouble manned by an unknown trailblazing human who never made it back home, perhaps even the original lost cosmonaut. And there were apparently more to follow on this doomed trajectory. In February 1961, now just a couple of months away from Yuri's historic flight, Torre Bert picked up a transmission in space which sounded like a heartbeat. A human heartbeat. Now, straight away I had a few doubts about why it had to be a human heartbeat. During this period, the Soviet Union and the US were sending a whole menagerie of creatures with heartbeats into space. The long list includes dogs, a chimpanzee called Ham, mice, rats, guinea pigs, a rabbit called Marfusha, fruit flies, tortoises, parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasps, man. Why would you... Just kill them all. Flower beetles, and a squirrel monkey called Gordo. Some of them even survived. I hope not the parasitic wasps.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
Yet the brothers were convinced that this quickened heartbeat was human in nature, and further transmissions picked up soon afterward appeared to confirm this theory. Amongst all the beeps and pings, which confirmed that the sounds were coming from an orbiting capsule, they heard wheezes and moans and strained breathing which resembled the sounds of a man who was slowly suffocating to death. A leading cardiologist at the time, Professor Achille Dogliotti, later publicly declared that he believed the recorded sounds were the final forced panting breaths of a human rather than a space squirrel monkey. What about a parasitic wasp, mate? Could these have been the dying moments of another anonymous cosmonaut who beat Yuri Gagarin to the stars, but was denied a place in the history books? Well, over the next few years, Achille and Giovanni picked up further transmissions in space which didn't challenge the official milestone set by Yuri Gagarin, as they were recorded after his flight during a bold new era in which it was accepted that human beings might now be mooching around somewhere in the stars. But these transmissions were particularly chilling, as they were venturing beyond beeps and clicks and heavy breathing. We were now hearing the actual voices and final words of doomed cosmonauts translated from Russian by Sister Maria, who is now fluent in the language. Recordings of 8 different events were made in total between 1960 and 1964. One memorable series of messages picked up in late 1961 appears to be the voices of one female and 2 male cosmonauts who are spiraling beyond the final chapter. Here's a condensed version of words lifted from the recording. Conditions growing worse. Why don't you answer? We are going slower. Remember us to the motherland. We are lost, we are lost. The world will never know about us. Perhaps the most spine-tingling message of all came quite a bit later, in 1963, from someone known only as Unknown Female Cosmonaut. Again, we'll condense the message as it gets a little bit repetitive and nonsensical, but here's a flavour of the final words heard from a disorientated cosmonaut clearly consumed by panic. Listen, come in, talk to me. I am hot, breathing. Oxygen, I am hot. Isn't this dangerous? How should I transmit? It's always hot. I can see a flame. Am I going to crash? Yes, I feel hot. I will re-enter. Fade to silence. The presumption here was that the unknown female cosmonaut perished in flame whilst attempting re-entry. And this could be another example of how the Soviet Union were sending far more people out into space than we ever knew about, but they were keeping quiet about the missions that didn't go to plan and leaving the lost cosmonauts to drift into eternal obscurity. A star-speckled skeptic might immediately assume that the Giudico-Cordiglia brothers were just having a laugh and that all of these recordings were faked for shits and giggles. Or maybe they just enjoyed soaking up all the attention and getting a bit famous for sharing recordings that were far from genuine. Spoiler alert, I think that's what it is. But that doesn't really seem their style. Working theory is the original one, like maybe that SOS stuff was genuine, and there was someone who got lost in space and the Soviets didn't admit it. I'm skeptical because it has been so long since then, but maybe after Yuri Gagarin went to space, the interest died down in this, and they were like, yeah, but we'd still like cool shit for our bunker. So they made some stuff up. Just a theory. Working theory so far. Achille and Giovanni were genuinely talented people with a passion for radio technology who were deadly serious about what they were doing. Torrey Burt wasn't just a set of fake props, it was a fully functioning listening station that had taken years to build with blood, sweat, tears, chicken wire, and very little money. It was quite an astounding accomplishment, which had built up a vast archive of credible results, now regarded by many as one of the most comprehensive private collections in existence. Experts reckon that the brothers were true pioneers in tracking satellites and recording space missions. Torrey Burt, and indeed the whole Zeus network, was permanently dismantled in the late 60s. Although the reasons were never made completely clear, it's probable that the amateur listening station had become more or less obsolete. By the time we get to the 69 moon landing, viewers around the world were watching the events unfold on live TV. There just wasn't as much interest in twiddling around with knobs and dials to pick up noises on the radio. Video killed the radio stars. Achille went on to become a cardiologist and died in 2015 at the age of 82. Giovanni reportedly went on to help train Italian police with tapping the phones of criminals and died in 2024 at the age of 85. But they consistently maintained their accounts for the rest of their lives, and pretty much everyone who ever met them was impressed with their integrity. It was often noted that they were obsessed with scientific process and didn't seem to have the capacity or inclination, or even perhaps the imagination, to just make things up. When Jules Morgans, the former editor of Vice magazine, interviewed Giovanni in 2020, he concluded that the guy wasn't interested in talking about emotional stuff, such as how he felt about certain landmark triumphs. Morgans felt that this was not because Giovanni had anything to hide, it's just that he wasn't remotely interested in discussing such seemingly trivial matters. He just wanted to talk about frequencies and antennas and chicken wire and the technical work that he and his brother put into Torrey Burt. The controversial broadcasts from Phantom Cosmonauts were just one tiny component of a much bigger adventure in which he took immense pride. Julian Morgans had no doubt that Giovanni was telling the truth. Some have argued that maybe the brothers themselves were utterly trustworthy, but they themselves were the victims of a hoax. Yeah, because, anyone can broadcast radio signals, right? With a little bit of kit. But taking into account their experience and diligence, it would have been a pretty elaborate hoax. In fact, at the very minimum, it would probably have required the launching of voice recordings into space aboard an orbiting capsule, which would have been beyond the capacity of a typical prankster and not something that national space programs would have squandered resources upon. The brothers certainly had lots of high-profile supporters at the time. Publications such as the Washington Post and Reader's Digest were singing the praises of these visionary Italian ether watchers and reporting all of their findings as solid facts. Even NASA seemed mightily impressed with the brothers, and you can't get a much higher endorsement than that. Well, other than from maybe Roscosmos, because they were leading. The brothers revealed how they paid a pretty unusual visit to NASA in 1964. NASA is all caps, right? Because I was reading, it was on I swear it was on BBC or something. NASA spelled big A, small s, small a. And I was like, but it's an acronym. National Aeronautic and Space Administration, right? And Danny's written it all caps, which looks completely correct to me. The other day I looked at that on BBC and I was like, that's not right. But I was like, oh, it's BBC, it must be right. Maybe there's two options? But NASA it's all caps, it should be all caps. They applied to appear on a super tough Italian quiz show called La Fiera di Sogni, or The Fair of Dreams, in which contestants answer a question on their chosen specialist subject. Achille and Giovanni naturally chose space as their specialist subject and easily romped home to victory by answering every single question correctly in record time. I suspect that at some point they'd read the 1964 equivalent of Doctor Who Discovers Space Travel. I feel like the 1964 equivalent of Doctor Who Discovers Space Travel would be Doctor Who Discovers Space Travel. It's often reported that the ultimate prize was all expenses paid trip to NASA, but the brothers later clarified that the top prize was actually $3,000, which they chose to spend on a trip to NASA. That's a lot of money for back in the day. Probably about 30 grand. Nice. And they got quite the reception. Achille and Giovanni were granted an audience with NASA's top eggheads who were reportedly dazzled by what the brothers had managed to do on such a tight budget. But this went much further than a mutual backslapping session. It wasn't until decades later, in 2008, that Giovanni revealed to the Fortean Times how he ended up exchanging information with NASA. The brothers still hadn't figured out two of the frequencies used by the Soviets, but NASA themselves were also missing two Soviet frequencies. As luck would have it, each party had the missing parts of the puzzle, but NASA was still wary of the brothers. Following a secretive and almost silent meeting behind closed doors with a guy from NASA's Tracking and Data Acquisition Department, which largely involved taking it in turns to scribble down numbers on bits of paper and hand them over, both sides walked away with all the Soviet frequencies. But NASA weren't the only ones to have taken an interest in the brothers. According to Giovanni, the KGB literally also came knocking on their door in the 1960s. They initially weren't aware that he was from the KGB. He introduced himself as a journalist who was just after a quick interview for a Russian newspaper. The brothers were happy to grant this request, and the man later scuttled away. They only discovered the truth a few hours later when another guy turned up at their door claiming to be from the Italian Secret Service. The guy warned the brothers that they'd just been visited by the KGB, who now had their eyes on Torre Bert, but he promised that the Secret Service would do everything within its power to protect them. He did, however, concede that they couldn't be everywhere and advised the brothers to be careful in the future. In 2008, Chris Hollington from the Fortean Times tracked down a former KGB agent who had gone on to take on the role of Russian ambassador to a European country. He was now living in Prague, that's where I live, and agreed to an interview with the Fortean Times, although he requested that the Russian embassy's literally... Oh, I don't want to say where my office is. It's close. It's very, very close, put it that way. He was now living in Prague and agreed to an interview with the Fortean Times, although he requested that his name and personal details be kept private. Yeah, you're going to talk some secrets about the KGB? Yeah, you better make sure it's private. The former agent admitted to Chris Hollington, "Of course we were interested in the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. They were hacking into our communications. Imagine that today, a pair of amateur kids taking apart the Russian space program like it was a toy. I heard the Gagarin recording, transcribed it, and verified it was genuine. Our cosmonauts were warned to be careful what they said while in space after this, and we had the brothers followed." Get followed by the KGB. That. You're like, hello. The former agent revealed how Achille and Giovanni's winning appearance on the Italian quiz show may have rewarded them with something of far more value than a day trip to NASA. He said, "They had to be dealt with. An accident, perhaps. Then the TV program happened and they were famous. That saved their lives. I was glad they were good kids." Oh my God. It's like, yeah, but also, it's like this guy, he's like, yeah, I'm glad they survived. But if my boss told me to take them out, I would 100% take them out. That's some proper KGB. Chris Hollington also managed to track down the dude from the Italian Secret Service who confirmed that contact was made with the brothers in the interests of protecting them and obtaining information about Soviet spacecraft. The three of them reportedly became very good friends. All this was apparently in sharp contrast to the official line from the Soviet Union at the time. Various sources suggest that the Soviets were quick to dismiss the Giudica Cordiglia brothers as clueless fraudsters. It's even been reported multiple times that General Nikolai Kamenin, the commander of the Soviet cosmonaut detachment at the time, gave an interview to the Daily Red Star in 1965 in which he described the brothers as the gangsters of space and declared that it was impossible for them to have tracked any of their signals or broadcasts. But I found no hard evidence for any of this, and it seems that the Daily Red Star wasn't even a real newspaper. Well then, I think we can officially say that is made up. It's far more likely that the Soviets said nothing at all and pretended that they weren't even aware of the claims made by the brothers. It wasn't in their style to go to the trouble of denying anything or making any unnecessary noise at all. As we already know, the Soviets were super secretive about their space missions and usually only made a public announcement when a mission had been successfully completed. They didn't tend to make any announcements at all about their failures, as hordes of dead cosmonauts drifting through space might have been viewed as mildly embarrassing. And this naturally makes you wonder how many failures were meant to be brushed under the cosmic carpet and whether enthusiasts such as Achille and Giovanni stumbled across signals and messages that were never intended to be heard. Now, before anyone begins to suspect that we might be getting a bit carried away on a tide of nutty conspiracy theories, I was a little bit worried about that, Danny. However, these guys do seem very straightforward. They just seem like engineers. Wasn't one of them a physicist? Oh, is he a physician or a physicist? I think he was a physician. But either way, they're very engineering. They don't seem like conspiracy theory dudes. I'm kind of changing my opinion on this. But there's no doubt that the Soviet Union had a track record of covering up a number of terrible space exploration tragedies in the 60s, some of which would remain a secret for the better part of 3 decades, while others might still be missing from the picture today. Ashes to ashes. You might remember that we mentioned the name Ivan Ivanovich at the beginning of the video. A forgotten figure who made it into space almost a year before that blow-in Yuri Gagarin. In May 1960, the Soviets launched an official unmanned Vostok spacecraft into the stars, The mission was known as Korabl Sputnik 1 over there, but more commonly referred to as Sputnik 4 in the West. The mission was not ultimately judged to be a success, as the guidance system cocked up during the attempt at re-entry, leaving the descent module stranded in orbit for well over a couple of years before it finally re-entered our atmosphere. It took another 3 years for the equipment module to make it back down to Earth. Ivan Ivanovich was aboard the burnt-up descent module, and his body was never found. But it wasn't necessarily the last mission that he ever undertook. For some reason, I thought he was killed on the launch pad. The legendary American hard science fiction writer and aeronautical engineer Robert Heinlein felt that he might know a thing or two about what was going on here. Nicknamed the Dean of Science Fiction, Heinlein produced 32 novels and 59 short stories during his acclaimed career, although he's probably more widely known today for writing the original 1959 novel Starship Troopers, upon which the 1997 movie was based. Is that true? Really? Heinlein revealed in a 1960 article published in the American Mercury entitled Pravda Means Truth that he and his wife Ginny had been traveling around Europe in May, a journey which eventually took them to Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, which was under Soviet occupation at the time. On the 15th of May, Heinlein got chatting to a mob of Red Army cadets who told him that the Soviet Union had just launched a man into orbit on that very day and asked him what he thought of it. Heinlein responded with his congratulations, but was secretly disappointed that the Soviets had yet again trounced the US in the latest leg of the space race. Later that evening, their tour guide barged into their hotel room in a bit of a flap and told the couple that the cadets had been mistaken and that the couple should forget everything that was said. Heinlein was a bit puzzled by this and left the hotel room to try and find a copy of the official Soviet newspaper Pravda to see if he could glean any more news about this major new milestone. It was usually a piece of piss to grab a copy of Pravda from pretty much anywhere, but on this evening, there were no copies to be found within the entire capital. He discovered later that other American tourists had experienced similar problems trying to source a copy of the paper on that day. This made him suspect that the news had made it into the paper, but the Soviets had later decided that the information wasn't for public consumption. I'm sorry, but there's no way that of all the however many thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of newspapers that are printed, that they all managed to be destroyed. Come on now. One of those would have come up in the last, when was this, the 60s? Like 60 years? The Red Army cadets had almost certainly been referring to Korabl Sputnik 1, which was launched on the same day that they were chatting to Heinlein and Ginny. It took the Soviet Union quite a while to admit that this launch had ever taken place at all. Of course it did. It was a failure. The official line was that the craft was unmanned, but Robert Heinlein remained convinced that a cosmonaut, possibly even the first man in space, was lost on this mission when his life support inevitably ran out whilst the craft was hanging around in orbit for years. Considering how all the cadets seemed to know about it, he felt this was probably even an open secret. There may have been a few crossed wires here, though. Ivan Ivanovich may have been aboard Korabl Sputnik 1, but the thing about doomed Ivan is that he was just a dummy in a spacesuit. Oh, he's called Ivan Ivanovich, right? I feel like that's their equivalent of like Joe Bloggs or John Smith or what's the American version? John Doe. Johnny Appleseed. This was the first of many missions for the Soviet space mannequin known as Ivan Ivanovich, who was brought into service to test life support and re-entry systems for the Vostok program. He didn't always survive the missions, but the name badge would get happily slapped onto his plastic successors. And they certainly looked the part, as the many incarnations of Ivan Ivanovich were designed to look as lifelike as possible, so lifelike in fact that the Russian word for dummy had to be placed underneath his visor just in case any dog walkers happened to stumble upon the crispy remains of a version of Ivan that had ejected from a spacecraft. You wouldn't want to frighten the dog walkers into believing that they'd come across a genuine corpse or an alien. Jesus Christ, coming across just a burnt corpse in a spacesuit just while on a walk, you'd be like, hello? Someone might want to come check this out. One interesting revelation here is that spacecraft such as Korabl Sputnik 1 were often equipped with audio recordings of voices in order to test the microphones and radio transmission systems. And straight away, this gets us thinking about the kind of transmissions that the Judica-Cordiglia brothers were picking up around this time. Could this be the explanation for the strange messages from the phantom cosmonauts? Rather than picking up actual human voices broadcasting from space, they were instead picking up simple test messages that had been pre-recorded on Earth. Well, it's a neat answer, in a way, but it still doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. The audio recordings sent up in Soviet spacecraft consisted of nothing more troubling than choir music, readings of poetry and literature, and in one case, a particularly good recipe for sour beetroot soup known as borscht. Unless the Soviets were in a particularly playful mood, it seems doubtful that they would go to the trouble of sending up staged recordings of people pretending to suffocate or burn to death. Yeah, it'd be a little bit weird, wouldn't it? And ultimately, despite the opinions of the dean of science fiction, there was no cover-up at work on the failed Karabi Sputnik 1. It would have been far too early in the Soviet space program to even consider sending a human into space. All the unearthed documentation reveals that the craft was occupied by nobody other than an early version of Ivan Ivanovich, who was accompanied in later Karabi Sputnik missions by rice, mats, dogs, rabbits, and plants. Mats. Okay. Whilst we're in the mood for debunking the least convincing conspiracy theories, let's drift back to the story of Vladimir Ilyushin, who's often considered to be the real first man in space, getting there 5 days before Yuri Gagarin. As you may remember, Ilyushin was forced into making an unguided emergency landing, ending up in China, where the critically injured cosmonaut was held captive for a year, while the Soviet Union pretended that he had been involved in a car crash. Dennis Ogden from the British communist newspaper The Daily Worker was the first to break the story, but he never named his supposedly reliable sources. And they couldn't have been that reliable because the following day, Dennis had completely changed his mind and wrote another story in The Daily Worker, which declared that Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. This follow-up story appears to have been largely forgotten, whilst the previous sensationalist piece is still the one that grabs all the attention. I suppose it could be contemplated that the Kremlin got to Dennis in the meantime and warmly advised him to write a completely contradictory story in the next edition of the paper for the sake of his own health. It's like, Dennis, you see that balcony, mate? You wouldn't want to fall off that, would you? Would you, Dennis? Would you, Dennis? But the problem is here, that Dennis Ogden's original story, put together with sources that were never named, is pretty much the entire basis on which this somewhat flimsy theory was built. Oh, well, that's it, okay? All the other newspaper reports that followed were just riffing off that original piece. Even that 1999 documentary film, The Cosmonaut Cover-Up, which promised to tell the whole story for the first time, doesn't really dish up anything new, aside from a couple of unconvincing interviews with a reporter who claims he once saw some documents, and a US resident who claims to have filmed the launch of Ilyushin's supposed flight, but doesn't bother sharing it with viewers. Okay, that's because it doesn't exist. The rest of it is just recycled rubbish padded out to fill a documentary, none of which is supported by the mountains of documentation relating to the Soviet space program, which was released much later on. One almost comical moment in the documentary is the bit where the narrator solemnly declares that Vladimir Ilyushin himself had promised to reveal his true story on camera, but decided against it when the producers showed up in Russia to interview him. I'm not convinced that Ilyushin would ever have made such a promise, but I doubt his version of events would have worked in the film's favour. His only previous words on the matter were to dismiss these claims as delusions. Be like, I don't know if he's the best shot for an interview, guys. For our documentary about how he's the first guy in space, he's like, you're mad. No, I wasn't. He wasn't even a bloody cosmonaut, he was a test pilot at the time, who went on to form the Soviet Rugby Federation in 1967. It's quite illustrious then. Forget being a spaceman, I brought rugby to Russia. It would appear that the car crash was genuine, and he really did get packed off to China for specialist medical treatment. It turns out that it wasn't so out of the ordinary after all. Whilst political rifts were developing between the two nations, they still remained pragmatic allies, and the Soviets often sent important people to China to receive specialist treatments that they couldn't receive at home. Oh, okay. Guess I was wrong about all of that then. It sounds as if Dennis Ogden just jumped to the wrong conclusion when he became suspicious about a story of a car crash and mashed this up in his head with the emerging new rumors that a cosmonaut death had been covered up just a few weeks before Yuri Gagarin's flight. And whilst there are more than enough groundless conspiracy theories floating around the ether, the rumors of the earlier cosmonaut cover-up were much later revealed to be absolutely true. But it happened on the ground rather than in the ether. Okay. Oh, is someone just broadcasting their own? The brothers are the victim of a hoax. In May 1961, a group of 20 cosmonauts were invited to participate in an enduring experiment inside the Chamber of Silence at the Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine in Moscow. The Chamber of Silence was a soundproof, low-pressure, high-oxygen isolation chamber with not an awful lot going on inside it. The obvious purpose being to replicate some of the conditions that you would experience in space. The chosen cosmonauts would take it in turns to enter the chamber alone, without any idea of whether they would be left in there for hours or days or weeks. If a certain light flickered on, This was the cosmonauts' cue to attach biosensors onto their own body so that their physiological responses could be measured for the next few hours. The chamber was largely empty inside, with such luxuries as a bed, a chair, a toilet, a hot plate, wooden knives for whittling, and a few puzzle books. Just for whittling? It's like, what are you going to do now? I'm just going to whittle. All right, Vladimir Bondarenko from Kharkov, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was the 17th of the 20 men to enter the Chamber of Silence. But he was only 10 days into what was intended to be a 15-day stint of solitude when tragedy struck in the unlikely shape of a cotton ball. Oh no, does it spark and ignite the high-oxygen environment? Bondarenko had reached the end of the day's monitoring phase, so he decided to heat some tea on the hot plate, remove his biosensors, and look forward to another quiet evening with a good puzzle. After removing his biosensors, he washed his skin with a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, which he then casually tossed into a nearby bin. But he missed. The cotton ball hit the hot plate and ignited into a small ball of flame. Oh god, you're in high-oxygen environments. This might not usually have been such a huge case for concern, were it not for the fact that Bondarenko was in a high-oxygen chamber, so the flames spread at an alarming rate within his silent prison. He desperately tried to smother the fire with the sleeves of his jumpsuit, but these caught fire too. Yeah, because it's all so oxygenated. As the Chamber of Silence was pressurized, there was an agonizing wait of half an hour before the door could be safely opened. Quite incredibly, he was still just about alive when he was dragged out of the chamber. His jumpsuit had melted, his whole body was covered in third-degree burns, his hair had gone, and there were no eyes in his face. Oh my f***ing god. Dude, he was still capable of speech and managed to utter his final words over and over again. It was my fault. Don't blame anyone. Oh, Jesus, that is so grim. He was rushed to hospital and attached to a drip, although this had been challenging to set up as the only blood vessels into which a needle could be inserted were eventually found on the soles of his feet. Oh, dude, this is terrible. Valentin Bondarenko died from shock 16 hours later, but the rest of the world didn't find out about this for well over 20 years. Well, rumors of a cover-up were swirling around for years, but the Soviet Union didn't officially acknowledge Bondarenko's death until 1986. And this makes him not only the first person we know about to lose his life in the pursuit of space exploration, but also the first genuine example of a lost cosmonaut, albeit one whose fate was eventually revealed, far too late for his rightful place next to the fallen astronaut memorial on the moon. Since 1991, however, Valentin Bondarenko does have a lunar impact crater on the far side of the moon, named in his honor. It's nice. I mean, I'd rather not be like, oh, Jesus Christ. It was my fault, don't blame anyone. And the soles of his feet for the needles. Whilst the Soviets may have spent 25 years pretending that Bondarenko never even existed, there were a few clues to be found for the dedicated space detective, such as the fact that he had already been photographed and filmed in a spacesuit and officially named one of the 20 men chosen to take part in the Chamber of Silence experiment. But as we'll discover in just a minute, the Soviets had sneaky ways of altering history. Indeed they did. In the meantime, a tragedy on a much larger scale unfolded on the 24th of October 1960. We still don't know for sure how many people were killed in the launch pad disaster that was known as the Nelyubov catastrophe, but it was the deadliest disaster in the history of space exploration. A prototype of an R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile was being prepared for a test flight at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Soviet Kazakhstan when the second stage engine accidentally ignited and detonated the first stage fuel tanks, causing a massive explosion which incinerated everybody in the immediate vicinity and either burned or poisoned everyone else who was standing further away. The final death toll was anywhere between 60 and 150 victims, including the Chief Marshal of the Artillery, Mitrofan Nelyubov, after whom the disaster was much later named. His entire body was reduced to ashes, and he could only be identified by one of his military shoulder marks, his watch, and his partially melted gold star. The guy who designed the missile, Mikhail Yangel, was also at the Cosmodrome, but had a narrow escape, purely because that he'd just nipped behind a bunker for a crafty smoke. Good lord, can you imagine being that dude? You're just like, oh my god, this cigarette saved my life. Smoke, everybody. That's got to be a rare example of a cigarette having actually saving somebody's life. There you go. Danny and I, same page. The Soviet government hushed up the disaster for 29 years, officially declaring that Mitrofan Nelyubov had been killed in a plane crash on a secret mission, while strongly encouraging the bereaved families to share similar stories of the other victims. Whilst the crumbling Soviet Union did eventually acknowledge the disaster in 1989, it was in a pretty vague manner, and we remain in the dark about the exact death toll and the names of most of the victims. Something else very shifty, and perhaps even a bit spooky, was going on in the 1970s. Cosmonauts were disappearing from old photographs. Oh, that is so strange. Like, the Soviet Union did this, right? There's that famous picture of Stalin and one of his spies or something, right? And it's just like Stalin walking along having a chat. And then the photos later, just Stalin walking along. The guy's been like, we'd call it photoshopped out, right? But why were they doing this to cosmonauts? Well, they may have been disappearing from photographs earlier than that, but it wasn't until the 1970s that keen-eyed stargazers first began to notice. Take Valentin Bondarenko, for example. Whilst the original lost cosmonaut may have enjoyed a presence in photographs from 1960, he had been completely pushed out of the pictures in later years, replaced by subtle background elements, as if he was never there in the first place. And he wasn't the only one. Several other cosmonauts had done a vanishing act from photographs within the space of a decade to be replaced with walls, stairs, and freshly sprung bushes. You imagine there's just a group of dudes and then a bush. It's like, wow, that's a weirdly placed bush, isn't it? In the days before Photoshop, it would have been a painstaking process to remove a person from a photograph in such a way that it wouldn't arouse suspicion. The Soviets had clearly invested a fair bit of time and effort into doctoring these images and rewriting history. A bit surprising, though, that they hadn't counted on somebody just comparing the doctored photographs to the originals and noticing the big person-shaped discrepancy. What's that bush doing there? It's pretty clear that Valentin Bondarenko was erased from history. His death was viewed as an embarrassing failure that the Soviets wanted to hide by pretending that no such cosmonaut ever existed. But what of the others? Could the panicked voices picked up by Judika Cordiglia brothers have belonged to some of these airbrushed cosmonauts? What terrible fate befell the ones who were purged from the pictures? Well, it doesn't seem as if any of these erased cosmonauts were lost in space, as groups of stellar sleuths have worked hard on putting the missing pieces together to figure out their fates. Yeah, it was the Soviet Union. It's like people, they just fell out of favour with the regime or something. It's like, oh no, we just no longer like you, so you're in the gulag and you're removed from history. Can you imagine all the people who've just been removed from history and we just don't know about? Like, because we always learn about the ones that fail because we know about them. But all the ones that are just like, yeah, successfully removed from history. It's probably lots. One particularly tragic example was a guy called Grigory Nelyubov, a promising cosmonaut candidate who at one point was heavily tipped to become the first man in space. He had the skills, the aptitude, and the confidence, but he also had a bit of a temper which could flare up after 1 or 2 bottles of baby shower. Following a drunken weekend off work in 1961, Nelyubov and 2 other cosmonaut buddies were staggering back home to Star City, but they got in a spot of bother when they tried to get into the facility without their identification papers, which they'd all mislaid. A nasty argument and possibly even a brawl ensued between the drunken cosmonauts and the security guards, who did eventually realize they were cosmonauts and offered them a chance to apologize so that the whole thing could be forgotten. An indignant Nelyubov told them exactly where they could go stick their apology. All 3 were kicked off the program and wiped from all photographs. Oh my god, guys, a bit of an overreaction. What the hell? Nelyubov later became a depressed and enraged alcoholic, taking his own life in 1966 by stepping in front of a train, an event which was officially described as a, quote, accident. Please. Whilst this was a particularly tragic case, most of the other erased cosmonauts were deleted for rather more mundane reasons. They had medical problems, or they failed tests, or just didn't make the grade for whatever reason. The Soviet Union just didn't want any perceived losers hanging around in their official photographs. I mean, but the fact that people got rejected implies that the people who are left are better than the people who got rejected. So wait, this feels like a good thing to be talking about. Not everyone is a superhero champion who can go to space. So this is another very clear demonstration that the Soviet Union often went to surprising lengths to cover up the truth when it came to cosmonauts whose careers had crashed. They even told long-running porkies about Laika the space dog. The official line for over 40 years was that Laika survived several days aboard Sputnik 2, and she was euthanized painlessly with a serving of poisoned food before her oxygen ran out. It was hailed as a thoroughly controlled and humane scenario that absolutely went according to plan. It wasn't until 2002 that the Russian scientist Dmitry Malyshenkov admitted at the World Space Congress in Houston, Texas, the fact that Laika had died within hours from overheating due to a failure with the thermal control system. Oh god, they cooked Laika. But on the flip side of the asteroid, wacky conspiracy theories still tended to emerge, even on the rare occasions when the Soviet Union was being surprisingly forthcoming, such as the first known death on a spaceflight in 1967. One of Yuri Gagarin's best friends was a fellow cosmonaut named Vladimir Komarov, who was selected as the solo pilot for Soyuz 1, which was about to embark on an ambitious mission involving a rendezvous with another Soviet spacecraft and an exchange of crew members before returning to Earth. It's reported that Komarov had serious doubts about the safety of the craft, which were all completely ignored, but he still volunteered his services anyway on this potentially suicidal voyage for one specific reason. Yuri Gagarin was the backup pilot and would take his place if Komarov pulled out. Komarov wanted to ensure that his good mate and Soviet hero didn't throw away his life on this reckless mission aboard a doomed craft. Well, couldn't Gagarin also pull out? Komarov would be like, I'm not doing it. And they'd be like, Gagarin, you're up. And he'd be like, I'm not doing it. I'm not getting on that death machine. And they're like, either you get on death machine or I use my death machine, which is like a gun, you know. Go out back behind the bunker. Here's a cigarette. A 2011 book by James Doran and Piers Bizzoni called Starman: The Truth Behind the Legend of Yuri Gagarin explores the life and career of the first man in space and goes into more detail on the tragic Soyuz mission. On the day of the launch, on April the 23rd, 1967, Yuri Gagarin reportedly turned up to the launch site, decked out in a spacesuit, and insisted that he fly the craft. It seems that both Yuri and Komarov were prepared to sacrifice their lives to save the other, but Yuri was shown the door, and Komarov was shoved inside Soyuz 1. As predicted, Komarov found himself battling against a barrage of technical problems and malfunctions as soon as he got into orbit. Ground control eventually ordered him to sack the whole thing off and return home. But alas, that wasn't possible. During the descent module's attempted re-entry, Komarov's plan was to deploy a drogue parachute followed by the main parachute to slow down and stabilize the speed of the capsule. However, the deploy parachute failed to deploy due to a design flaw, and then the main parachute got tangled up in the drogue. As a result, the descent capsule slammed back down into Earth in a fiery ball, and the charred remains of Vladimir Komarov were later retrieved by a recovery team. It's alleged that his final communications to the ground was an angry rant in which he cursed the people who'd put him in a botched spaceship and practically accused the Soviet space program of murder. I mean, yeah, he saw it coming, Yuri saw it coming, and they did it anyway. It was insane. In contrast to previous tragedies, the Soviet Union made no attempt to hush up this failed mission and the death of Vladimir Komarov. This may have been partly down to a new approach, in which the Soviets were more open to admitting their failures while showing solidarity with other nations who had recently suffered tragedies, most notably the Apollo 1 fire earlier in 1967, in which 3 American astronauts were killed during a launch rehearsal test. Or it could have been that the Soyuz mission had already generated huge attention beforehand, and it would have been a nigh on impossible to try and cover it up. But the dodgy elements of this story are not the hard facts as revealed by the Soviet Union, but the embellished elements that came into orbit later on. Now, the basics of the story are absolutely true. Komarov expressed strong reservations beforehand about the safety of the craft, which would ultimately be the cause of his death following the technical glitches and the failure of the parachutes, which caused Soyuz 1 to plummet towards the Earth. But some historians have expressed doubt over many of the other claims made in the 2011 Starman book. Whilst it's not completely out of the question. Oh, right, so the whole previous thing was just according to that Starman book? Okay, but apparently it's not 100% reliable, according to some people. While it's not completely out of the question that Yuri Gagarin may have been named as the backup pilot, and that Komarov only piloted the shoddy craft to save his friend's life, it seems unlikely that such drastic measures were required. Yuri was a hero at this point, but his reward for this glorious triumph was to effectively be banned from future space flights, as the Soviet Union didn't want to risk killing their biggest star. Yeah, he's just more valuable as a propaganda piece than he is as an astronaut. He's like, I was too successful. He was downgraded to flying aircraft for the rest of his career, and even if didn't he die in an air crash? Wasn't that how he finally died? And even if he was officially listed as the backup pilot for the Soyuz mission, it would have been a symbolic designation. If Komarov had pulled out of the mission, somebody other than Yuri would have taken his place. It also seems incredibly unlikely that Yuri just barged through to the launch site in a spacesuit and demanded to fly the craft. This event was supposedly witnessed by a former KGB agent, but historians argue that we know practically nothing about the career or reliability of this agent. Yeah, also, where's he getting a spacesuit from? I'm pretty sure that when they're putting a dude into space, they're not like, oh yeah, just come in your spacesuit today. They put the spacesuit on them. right in a lab filled with people with like white coats. And considering that Yuri knew he wasn't supposed to be getting launched into space on that day, it would have been remarkably strange behavior. And for those final enraged communications in which Komarov vented his fury at ground control, the Soviet Union released the transcripts of his final communications shortly after the tragedy. And he actually sounds quite perky. He says, "Don't worry, I feel excellent. Everything is in order." Ground control responds they're not worried at all and recommend that he takes a deep breath. Komarov's last intelligible words, "Thank you for transmitting all of that. Separation occurred." At this point, ground control confirms that they understand, and after a pause, they repeatedly ask Komarov if he can hear them. But there's no further response from the craft. Ugh. American historian Asif Siddiqui has declared that he is 100% certain that these official transcripts are accurate, although other more cynical souls have expressed doubts and pointed out that anything released by the Soviet Union isn't worth the paper it's printed on. To say you're 100% certain as a historian is like, that's a big statement. Like 100% certainty. I suppose it's possible that the transcripts were edited to remove the final bits of the heated conversation in which Komarov wishes 1,000 curses on the Soviet space program. But another thing to bear in mind is that the situation was looking quite healthy when Komarov was still in a position to transmit messages to ground control. There's a brief communication blackout during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Yes, I learned about this in the Apollo 13 movie, where they're coming down and they're just waiting, and they're like, there's like a minute or so where they don't hear from them because of the, entering the atmosphere or whatever, like interference, and they're just waiting and waiting to hear. As the craft becomes enveloped in a bubble of ionized air which blocks any radio signals, well, there you go. That's what's doing it. You've probably seen old footage of those silent, agonizing, nail-biting moments at NASA between the attempted re-entry and the confirmation that the astronauts have made it through. The parachutes failed during this communication blackout, and Komarov would have only realized there was a problem during his very last moments. Even if he did spend those moments fiercely raging against the people who'd put him in a botched spaceship, nobody would have heard. They don't record it on board, like in a black box. Incidentally, if it's true that Komarov sacrificed his life to save Yuri Gagarin, then his buddy didn't exactly make the most of it, as Yuri himself would not live to see the first man on the moon. He was killed during a routine training flight, there you go, on board a MiG-15 fighter jet in 1968, sparking a period of national mourning in the Soviet Union. But this was another event clouded in secrecy, and there are various different accounts of the cause of the accident. We still don't know for sure exactly what happened, and this uncertainty has naturally spawned yet more wild conspiracy theories. Some say he was murdered by the KGB, as he was becoming a heavy drinker and may have been on the verge of revealing that he wasn't really the first man in space. No, I don't. Come on. Others say the accident was staged and Yuri was given a facelift before retiring to a secret life under a new name. Probably all nonsense, of course, but this does leave us in a bit of a prickly parallax when it comes to assessing the sounds and signals picked up by the Achille and Giovanni Giudica brothers. We do know that silly conspiracy theories have sprouted and flourished from plumes of silence and secrecy, as we might expect. But we also know that the Soviet Union had a very real habit of covering up cosmonaut deaths and huge disasters during the days of the space race. And they weren't averse to cropping cosmonauts out of photos. So is it really so outlandish to believe that a couple of talented, passionate, and seriously logical amateur radio operators could have tuned into a cluster of grim Soviet secrets that were frantically echoing through the void? Serious moonlight. We primitive Earthlings don't always get things right the first time, and perhaps it wouldn't be so surprising if Yuri Gagarin's successful mission in 1961 wasn't the first time that mankind had attempted to propel a human being into space. He could have been the second, or third, or the 27th cosmonaut to make the attempt, following in the footsteps and learning from the mistakes of earlier failed missions. It's worth emphasizing, again, that all those chilling voices and final messages picked up by Achille and Giovanni were spoken after Yuri's mission. And so the only evidence picked up by the brothers which might point to earlier failed missions that predated his flight were the SOS signal, the heartbeat, and the apparent sound of a man suffocating. And straight away, there's a very clear problem with those last 2 points. While I initially assumed that they must have just picked up a heartbeat of a space dog or a space guinea pig or something like that rather than a human, even this would have been impossible. Heartbeats and breathing rates would never have been broadcast to ground control. They would certainly have been recorded, as stuff like this was obviously quite important to monitor. You would need to know if your cosmonaut was on the verge of a heart attack. But the heartbeats and breathing rates would have been converted into electrical signals and beamed down to the ground as telemetry data. If anyone intercepted this, it would have sounded like fuzzy static. It certainly wouldn't have sounded like a clear audio recording of a heartbeat, as if the cosmonaut was pointing a massive microphone at his own chest. He probably had more important things to be doing. Which is why I think this is like a broadcaster somewhere else. I don't think the brothers are the scammers here. I think they just got taken in by someone who was broadcasting these signals just for fun. And then they probably saw it in the news and they were like, let's continue making the signals and make them more crazy. Another pretty fundamental point about the earlier SOS signal is that the Soviet Union simply weren't ready to shoot humans into space in the late 1960s, which is when the signal was supposedly intercepted. Over the following months, the Soviets were still sending dogs, other animals, and mannequins out into space on experimental missions that weren't always successful and often ended with the deaths of the passengers. It would seem a strange decision to send real human beings into space long before they'd even figured out how to confidently bring back an animal that was still breathing or a mannequin that was still in one piece. Unless, as speculated by some conspiracy theorists, the Soviets ran a secret black space program alongside their public space program. The theory goes that this black program may have included far more reckless missions undertaken by suicidal cosmonauts who weren't expected to return home. But I mean, this is I don't think so, guys. But I'm struggling with that idea, as the official public program was hardly an open book either, and could arguably be itself described as a black program, unless a mission just so happened to work out. Now, some of this is already beginning to sound a bit dodgy, but it does get even dodgier when we take a close listen to the voices that we heard later. For starters, it was noted that at no point in any of the recordings did the Phantom cosmonauts identify themselves, follow basic standard communication protocol, or use the correct terminology. I would have been happy to let this slide under the circumstances, as I imagine that even the most professional cosmonauts might have skipped a few bits of protocol when faced with the imminent prospect of being burned to a crisp. Yeah, but the language won't. If they've been referring to something as a specific, by a specific name for ages, they're not going to suddenly refer to it as a different name. It's just what they're used to using. So, no, I don't. I think this is just someone playing a prank on these brothers. But the language and accents are harder to explain away. Oh, I remember. Maybe the person on the recordings wasn't very good at speaking Russian. So, they probably weren't Russian. It's been observed that the Russian cosmonauts don't appear to have a particularly good grasp of the Russian language, often making basic grammatical errors and occasionally coming out with pure disjointed gobbledygook. It's not entirely awful, and bits of it do make sense, but some scholars have been left with the impression that Russian is not the native language of the speakers, who have instead been making valiant attempts to learn the Russian language as best they could. Some have even noticed a distinct Italian inflection in the words spoken by the unknown female cosmonaut. Let's not forget, it was Maria, the sister of the Italian brothers, who had been given the task of learning the Russian language so that any potential messages could be translated. Could she actually have been landed with a slightly more creative job? On a more technical note, it's very surprising that the amateur listening station, Torre Burt, was the only facility on planet Earth to pick up the messages. And when I say very surprising, I mean, of course, downright sketchy. Whilst we know that the brothers made an admirable job of building up an effective listening station from chicken wire and scrap metal, it's still hard to believe that this homemade effort picked up signals and communications which were overlooked by the hugely sophisticated installations in the US, UK, France, and Germany, which had billions of dollars lavished upon them. It could be argued that these other installations did indeed pick up the signals and chose to keep quiet. Why would they? They're on the West. They're going to be like, guys, are you killing your cosmonauts? Stop. But that doesn't really make any sense when you factor in the competitive nature of the space race, exactly. If the US had ever got wind of an embarrassing cock-up by the communists, they would have been shouting it from the tallest lunar peaks. I suppose it could just be the case that the Torre Burt station was even more advanced than we ever imagined. It's a shame in a way that it was dismantled in 1968. Had it been running in 1977, it might have backed up findings of the Big Ear telescope in Ohio by latching onto the WOW signal. And you may have already picked up on another problem with the voice broadcasts when we were talking about the doomed cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Communications are blocked during the phase in which the cosmonaut is attempting re-entry. Pretty much all of the messages picked up by the brothers appear to depict cosmonauts in this exact phase. The unknown female cosmonaut even declares that she's getting hot and can see a flame. This is why we know it's fake. It's just a question of who faked it. But there's no way that any communications would have been possible during these critical final moments. Admittedly, the final words of the unknown female cosmonaut are, "I will attempt re-entry," which indicates that she's not yet entered this phase, but in that case, there's no real reason for her to see flames or feel hot unless the sandwich toaster had caught fire again. Perhaps the biggest issue of all is that there's not a single shred of other supporting evidence to back up the claims that the recordings were genuine. I mentioned a moment ago that the Soviet space program was hardly an open book, and this was certainly true at the time, but it's not the same story today. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Russia declassified enough official space program documents to fill a black hole. It was during this period that the truth behind many of the secrets and cover-ups were revealed to the world for the very first time. According to Mark Wade, editor of the reference website Encyclopedia Astronautica, pretty much the entire early history of the Soviet space program has been opened up in exhaustive detail. But there's nothing within those declassified documents that connects in any way with the recordings made by the Debunking brothers. So, all we have to go on is the word of the brothers and the relatively small batch of recordings that have been made publicly available, which includes the controversial final broadcasts of the Phantom Cosmonauts. The majority of the material collected at Torre Burt apparently sits in a mysterious private collection, which makes it a bit tricky to ascertain the value, if indeed there was ever much to be found. I'm still a bit confused, though, as unless Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia were wholly incompetent and kept making mistakes or jumping to wrong conclusions, that leaves us with the only plausible conclusion, and that's that they were pulling our plonkers all along. And this seems very odd, considering that they were deemed to be incredibly sober and earnest people by many who met them, and the fact that they were clearly high-brain radio operators who had invested a chunk of their lives into setting up a mightily impressive listening station and even developing an entire global network populated with people who took their passion very seriously. The brothers exchanged secrets with NASA and were hunted down by the KGB, who were considering wiping them off the celestial map for good. They hardly sound like harmless pranksters. No, this is it. They do seem like very serious, science-y types, which is why I still think, even with the sister and the Russian accent and stuff, I still think they're being had on by someone else. Well, I'm not entirely convinced by the thing with the KGB. It's a story that Giovanni shared later in his life, backed up by the Fortean Times journalist Chris Hollington, who claimed to have tracked down both the KGB agent in question and the guy from the Italian Secret Service who promised to try and protect the brothers. But as both of these interviewees conveniently chose to remain anonymous, it doesn't really give us that much to work with. It's possible that the Russians did take some kind of interest in these amateurs who were tracking their signals and making claims to the press about all kinds of crazy shit, but I'm not sure we'll ever know the full story. However, acts of violence or assassinations or random rugby tackles from the KGB were usually only wheeled out for extremely high-profile targets or defectors. It seems a bit far-fetched to imagine they'd be getting that hot under the collar about a couple of amateur radio enthusiasts who are hardly going to bring down the Soviet Union. James Oberg is an American space journalist and historian who spent 22 years working for NASA as an engineer and a specialist in orbital rendezvous. He's also widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts on the Russian and Chinese space programs. So, I feel like he's a guy that we should be listening to when he expresses his serious reservations over the claims made by the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. Oberg has serious doubts that the trip to NASA played out the way the brothers suggested. It's generally accepted that Achille and Giovanni won a trip to NASA on an Italian quiz show, although even this is hard to prove as no concrete evidence has emerged. Whilst it does appear that there was a genuine, tough Italian quiz show that ran in the 60s, which had a name that translates to The Fair of Dreams, no details exist of an edition won by the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. However, I'm prepared to take their word for it, partly because I wouldn't want to rob them of their glory if it's true, and partly because it's not particularly important either way. What happened next sounded a bit odd, though. It's one thing to win a trip to a visitor center in NASA, but it's quite another thing to end up swapping secrets in NASA headquarters with high-ranking NASA personnel. Yes, it is. And it's hard to figure out how one event could have led to the other. I'm pretty sure that most casual visitors don't end up getting stopped by staff from the Tracking and Data Acquisition Department to see if they just happen to have any secret Soviet frequencies on their person. There's no evidence forthcoming from NASA that such meetings ever took place, and all we have from the brothers is a solitary photograph. It's not a very compelling photograph, though. It's a picture of the brothers standing on the sidewalk in Washington, D.C. and pointing to a big NASA sign. Just the kind of photograph that any tourists make. It's like, look, we did give information to NASA. Look, we're at NASA. It's like, bro, I went to the place, is it Cape Canaveral in Florida? It's like, I've swapped secrets with NASA. I've been to Cape Canaveral. There's photos of me. I might have been like 7 years old, and just on the bus tour, but you know. James Oberg even has doubts that the brothers ever picked up transmissions from Yuri Gagarin's heavily documented flight, or that they picked up broadcasts from Mercury Atlas 6, the first crewed American orbital spaceflight in 1962. Oberg's reasoning is that the orbit of both crafts would have been way out of range of Italy and impossible to intercept on the relatively clunky equipment they were using. In fact, Oberg believes that for the most part, Achille and Giovanni were just spouting a whole lot of static from where the moon doesn't shine. Another very real tragedy took place on the Soyuz 11 mission of 1971, which involved the deaths of 3 cosmonauts named Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. They were all exposed to the vacuum of space following a catastrophic depressurization of their craft during preparations for the attempted re-entry. Although the capsule landed back on Earth, the 3 cosmonauts inside were found dead, with dark patches on their faces and stains from where the streams of blood had flowed from their noses and ears. Oh my god, space is brutal. These poor guys were meant to be the backup crew, but the original crew was replaced at the last minute when one of them was suspected to have tuberculosis, although this was later revealed to be an allergic reaction to pesticide. They'd be like, oh my god, that's the one time I was glad I thought I got tuberculosis. Tuberculosis still exists, right? People still get tuberculosis, like in poorer parts of the world, I think. Yeah, what a miserable disease. Consumption, as they'd originally called it, because you just waste away. Initially, the causes of death were listed as suffocation, but this was later corrected to hemorrhaging of the blood vessels in their brains. I don't know what's worse, to be honest. I'd probably rather take a brain hemorrhage than suffocating to death. The point is that these were the first human beings known to have died in space. And despite the various claims and theories proposed over the years, they remain the only 3 people known to have died in space. We're not counting Vladimir Komarov, as he technically died during re-entry. The recordings made by Achille and Giovanni are nowhere near reliable enough to change this fact. It's difficult to figure out exactly what they were playing at. So many people are convinced that the vast majority of their work was completely sincere. But for one reason or another, it seems that they decided to concoct a few very tall tales from time to time. Perhaps they did it to maintain the interest of all the journalists who were hovering around Torre Bert and keeping the facility in the pages of the newspapers. The press might have lost interest if all they were ever getting out of Achille and Giovanni were a few beeps and whistles. Perhaps it had something to do with the funding and development of the listening station. We know that money was scarce, so maybe the brothers were throwing a few thrilling stories in to maintain excitement amongst potential investors. They may have ended up getting a taste of this kind of thing. Whilst the original idea may have been just to concoct 1 or 2 fake stories, they quickly realized that the fake stories were the only thing getting practical results. Perhaps they really were just hungry for fame, or maybe they just really hated Russians and wanted to make them look like losers. I'm inclined to feel generous and conclude that 99% of their work was legitimate and rooted in a genuine fascination with the sounds of the stars. Well, 95% or 90%, maybe 75%, but a lot anyway. We know that Julian Morgans from Vice magazine felt strongly that Giovanni wasn't interested in talking about the more adventurous claims during an interview in 2020, preferring instead to talk about the technical accomplishments of Torre Bert. Julian Morgans put this down to a highly technical mind that wasn't interested in discussing the more sensational stories, but I wonder if it might more likely be that an elderly Giovanni was feeling a little bit embarrassed at this stage and was more interested in talking about the achievements that he and his brother really did make rather than the ones that they made up. Allegedly. I suppose the Soviet Union has to take some of the blame for creating a secretive environment of lies and very real cover-ups in which strange stories like this can quickly gain traction and take on a life of their own. You never get this kind of thing with a far more transparent policy of NASA. I mean, it's not like anybody questions the moon landings, is it? Is no one considering the idea that someone could be having the brothers on? Like just broadcasting a message to them, just for them? I think the thing about him not wanting to talk about it later on in life is very telling, though, that he might be just a bit like, oh yeah, no, we kind of made that up, but we also did some actual cool. I guess it's not out of the question that there really are still some secrets to be exposed from the Soviet space program, although I doubt that we'll find any of the answers within a recording of a voice with an Italian inflection speaking a lousy version of Russian. But as we head back to our starting point near the fallen astronaut memorial in the valley of Hadley Rill on the moon, we should pay tribute to the real fallen cosmonauts from Star City who didn't make it onto the commemorative plaque because their tragic deaths were never revealed at the time. Thank you for watching.